Hi, this is Klute, and you're in my studio in deepest, darkest Suffolk, where I'm going to be talking a bit about a track I made for my new album called Center of the Crystal. I'll be talking roughly about my process and looking at a few of the plugins that I've used and, the general chaos and madness that goes on when I try and make music. Well, the truth be told, this is a track that I've done for my album called Center of the Crystal. And it was done over a year ago. And it's a kind of job trying to remember where it all started or whatever. But I'm, as you can see, a bit of a horror soundtrack fan, really. So I think the ideas for this track started just collecting sounds, bits and pieces that kind of all fit together and gave me this kind of not exactly horror but sci-fi sort of quirky vibe. So I kind of collected together stuff that gave me just sort of an atmosphere, a sort of slightly bizarre tension feeling. And I think the first things, I would have gone through some horror soundtrack records and stuck samples into a favourite plugin of mine called Serato Sample, which is absolutely fantastic. It just kind of brings this kind of the Serato algorithm to VST. So it's enormously helpful just to chuck samples at it and just see what happens. And it's always kind of, and you end up with something completely different and takes you in a different direction, but you can just kind of turn things inside out and tune them and time them and all that kind of good stuff. But I would have basically ended up with what I've got here is a printed version of what I would have done in Serato Sample. Serato Sample looks something like this. It's just basically the waveform you put things in. This is a different sample. And what I would have come up with was a kind of elongated horror string. And this is enough to just kind of give me the spark my imagination, give me an atmosphere. And there's various ways that you can kind of mess around with Serato Sample. You can adjust the key, the pitch, you can transpose, you can keep it in a kind of assumes a sync, but it isn't. So you kind of end up with off-kilter and very strange sort of polyrhythmic things happening. So when you've got some things that are kind of beatless, like a horror string, you can end up with just strange reactions and stuff like that. So I would have manipulated that original sample in Serato Sample and then processed it with one of my favorite plugins like Valhalla Shimmer or one of the sound toys, what's it called, the Echo, Sound Toys Echo. But because I printed it, I no longer have that history. But anyway, so generally the way that I like to work is I kind of, I'll look for sounds that will give me a kind of an identity to the idea, a kind of direction, and from that point on I'll look straight away for rhythm, so I can kind of start creating a loop or a pattern with what I'm doing. And with this track quite specifically, I started with this beat, which was something that I believe yeah, it would have been from a library of breaks that I was given. I was going to say it as a stylus preset, but it's not. It's something that someone's given to me called In the Jungle Break. So basically, go back to the beginning here. So basically, we ended up with a kind of a running rhythm. I think originally I had it running as a straight two-step drum and bass beat, which was, I think it sort of rears its head for a section later on in the track. But I kind of went back to the track and kind of developed kind of half-beat rhythm to it, even though it's still got some pace to it. So this was kind of my main rhythmic basis to go with my atmosphere. So from that point on, I'm kind of thinking, you know, slightly sort of voodoo-like atmospheres and vibes, and started looking for other things that you know, sat within that feeling, I guess. The next one being this kind of something that's actually from a music library record. Just kind of that kind of slightly detective tension thing that kind of just sits in like that. And I start collecting all these kind of just these layers. Most of my stuff is pretty layered and you know, polyrhythmic and just out there, I suppose. So yeah, I had this basis, and somewhere along the line, within Stylus RMX, which is a bit of a favourite of mine, just kind of got used to it over the years, I stumbled across this would have been a preset from a library of some kind, and spent the next sort of few days trying to mold this into some kind of usable thing. It was quite spiky, very I don't know, it's one of those things where you have a sound, but there's too much other stuff going on. You kind of got to hone in through processing to trying to get out what you want out of it instead of leaving it all in. So I ended up making about 3 layers. There's a bounced version, and yeah, it eventually sort of ended up being something that I could work with. So basically, in all the layers for the bongo section, I would have basically been fighting with the sound, and lots of EQ, lots of there's the transient master on it, compression, and then on the other one I'm kind of EQing another, not EQing, but compressing. Actually, the other one is EQing it, but just basically kind of just kind of trying to mold things together. The bounced version is very bizarre. It's kind of ended up being a bit of a muffled, trying to give it some underneath weight. So you end up with just a tower of bongos, basically, without things poking out too much. I quite enjoy sort of messing around with things like that, and these days there's quite a few sort of toys that enable you to kind of identify. I'm a big fan of a plugin called Soothe. Soothe being this kind of, this is what I would have used for processing the bongo during the bounce. Is basically it's a kind of, again, it's another I suppose broad spectrum de-esser in a way, compressor, but basically it kind of decides what it thinks are kind of antisocial resonant frequencies, and I find it really useful, even if it's just to use it as an indicator and not necessarily use it to do the actual processing, but it just get a general idea if some antisocial things, you see kind of what it views as resonant frequencies, and it scoops them out. But I think in this track I enjoyed doing that a lot. A lot of the process of making a track is very kind of self-indulgent, and becomes a bit like I don't know, Lego building or whatever. No, not quite Lego building, because it's more creative than that, but you spend a lot of time just kind of doing stuff. There's a lot of joy out of doing stuff that could possibly be completely pointless and aimless, but you sort of it's all part of the process, I guess. So bongo riff and tension string and rhythm are upon us, and so I kind of have a kind of, what I see as a kind of a third of an idea, which is kind of traditionally where I find things are most difficult for me, is kind of got the basis of an idea. Do I have enough to keep going and make a track? So I think the kind of at this point, when I've kind of got a riff, a rhythm, or a main beat, and a kind of a harmonic element, I will look for something to kind of anchor it, a sort of, I don't know, a hook, I suppose. And it would have been stumbling across a sample from the film Zardoz.
Come into the center of the crystal.
And that kind of just, for me, kind of definitely kind of put this, it kind of, I don't know, put that total identity on where this was going, and it was kind of the kind of turning point for me, just to have this kind of element kind of directing and kind of giving it a kind of full-on voodoo vibe. Kind of got tribal drums running, you got very tense, mysterious strings, and a savage kind of bongo riff over it, and so it was enough for me to start looking for other rhythmic elements and a bass line. So with me, a lot of the work that I do with all kind of dance music that I do is I like to mess around with layering beats, polyrhythms, and just things that come out, and then kind of start sort of mushing things together and pulling beats out, and you know, just combining things. I'm trying to find where this would have been the second rhythm that I added, which is would have been a full beat in stylus. Actually, no, it wasn't stylus. It was I think I just pulled up Groove Agent in Cubase and just kind of started messing around, and just to kind of accentuate that sort of the tribal element to it. And there's just pull up groove agent. Not a particularly amazing drum machine, but it's literally anything rather than using machine, which is, I find, complete nightmare to use. And so basically just kind of layered that on there. On top of it, there's a little bit of delay going on that. Just a little bit of echoing dub delay on it, just to fill things out. And I lost my arrange page. So with that, you just start building up the beats. A little bit of back up there, and another little bit of 909 ride. Actually, just quite, for me, it's quite a simple beat. Yeah, just a little bit of amen there. Always got a little bit of amen in your tune. So, having kind of got my main beat, which probably the whole process of kind of writing that beat would have gone on continually very much into the end part of making the track. So it definitely wouldn't have been written at the beginning. So at that point, you've got a kind of beat, so it's time to put a bass in. And again, that would have been a long, laborious process. Of choosing various different synths, possibly Trillion. This one I used a plugin called Kick, which is actually a kick drum plugin to synthesize bass drums, but it's got a chromatic element to it, so it can be extremely useful for using it to make basses in it. That's not particularly descriptive bass sounds, but if you just kind of want a basic 808 style sub bass, it's very useful for that. So I used that, and again I ended up layering it, kind of idiosyncratically kind of layered it, but somehow I kind of added this octave to it. And it kind of just ended up making it 100 times fuller. So this process, again, it would have been a work in progress. You would have had a basic bass in there as the arrangement started to grow, and then positioning of notes and stuff like that would have, as you see, things muted out as I've gone along and sort of thought about things and positioning and stuff like that, the kind of interaction with where the bass hits with the kick drum and stuff like that. On this track, the kick drum is, it's very loud and pokey kick drum, but kind of ended up leaving it that way and not trying to compress it out or anything like that, because it just kind of just added to it. So I did a lot of stuff to kind of take away too much impact on that kick drum with this fun little there we go, don't know what's going on, this fun little plugin called Track Spacer, which is not behaving. There we go. Basically, Track Spacer is another kind of, I suppose, it's basically, it is a side chaining plugin. It will kind of compress what's coming in. It's completely across the spectrum, but the idea being that it saves you some valuable headroom where things are going to conflict, like kick drums and bass lines, and if there's something, you've got a large expanse of string sound and you just don't need you know, that low end when there's a bass line coming on. It's great just to have that there instead of simply just shelve the entire string or atmosphere and kind of losing its weight sort of thing. So I just had bought that around the time of this track and used it quite heavily just to mess around and stuff. Well, that's about all the time we've got. If you want to see some more, go and buy the latest issue of Computer Music. And if you don't, I'll shoot my dog.